It was the second week of August 1943, somewhere east of the ruined rail junction at Bogodukov, and a Soviet infantryman named Pyotr Suslov was lying flat in a sunflower field when he saw something that made him stop breathing. A German tank was rolling toward the Soviet line, engine snarling, hatch open, and standing in the turret was a man in a black panzer jacket, waving his arm and shouting in Russian. Suslov's first instinct was to run. His second instinct, the one that saved his life, was to notice the tank had a crude red star painted over the cross on its hull, and that the man shouting was not calling for surrender. He was warning his own side not to shoot. That single moment, a German-built machine crewed by Soviet tankers, defended by Soviet infantry who had been told, sometimes only hours earlier, not to destroy every enemy silhouette they saw, captures something almost nobody expects about the Eastern Front. By the war's end, Soviet forces had taken possession of hundreds of German armoured vehicles in fighting condition or close to it. Various wartime tallies, compiled by trophy collection units working behind the front lines, put the number of usable captured tanks and assault guns recovered across 1943 to 1945 at roughly 317, a figure that shows up again and again in the ledgers of the Red Army's rear services. 317 machines, built in Kassel and Nibelungenwerk and Alket, designed to break the Soviet Union, that instead ended up wearing the Red Star and fighting for it. The German High Command did not think this was possible, not in any serious way. Wehrmacht armour doctrine assumed that a captured tank was, at best, a curiosity. Panzer crews were trained to disable vehicles beyond quick repair before abandoning them, to burn documents, to destroy optics, to render a stranded Panzer IV as useless to the enemy as a heap of scrap. German planners believed their own industrial and technical superiority was so significant that the Soviets, even if they somehow got a German tank running, would have no meaningful way to supply it, maintain it, or integrate it into their fighting formations. It was not arrogance, exactly. It was a reasonable extrapolation from everything the Germans had seen of Soviet industry in 1941, when whole factories were being evacuated on flat cars ahead of the advancing front, and Soviet mechanized units were being annihilated faster than they could be replaced. But that assessment rested on an assumption that stopped being true sometime around Stalingrad, and the Germans never fully updated it. The assumption was that a captured machine is only as valuable as the army holding it is competent, and competence in the Soviet system did not mean glamour or good press. It meant an unglamorous, sprawling, often chaotic but ultimately effective apparatus for turning wreckage into weapons. This is where the story stops being about individual tanks and starts being about a system, because the truth is that no single act of heroism explains what happened to those 317 vehicles. What explains it is an institution that most people have never heard of, the trophy collection teams, known in Russian as Trofeini Komandi, small units of engineers, mechanics, and quartermasters who followed immediately behind the advancing infantry with one job, not to fight, to count, catalogue, and where possible, recover. These teams worked a battlefield the way a salvage crew works a wreck. A knocked-out Panzer IV with a jammed turret ring might be marked for scrap and cannibalization. A Stu 3 with a blown track but an intact engine and gun might be flagged for repair. A Panther abandoned with a full fuel tank because its crew ran out of time to torch it, and those happened more often than German doctrine liked to admit, might be flagged for immediate frontline use, sometimes within days. The system had grades, priorities, transport requisitions. It was bureaucratic in the most literal sense, and that bureaucracy, unglamorous as it sounds, is precisely why it worked when improvisation alone would not have. Because here is the number that made all the difference, and it is not a number about tanks at all. It is a number about railway gauge. Soviet rail lines ran on a broader gauge than the European standard the Germans used, which meant that as the front moved west and then east again, entire depots of German spare parts, entire warehouses of ammunition stamped with Wehrmacht ordnance codes fell into Soviet hands intact, because retreating German logistics units could not always evacuate everything by rail before Soviet forces overran the depots. A tank without spare parts is a monument. A tank with a functioning parts pipeline is a weapon. The Soviets, almost by accident of geography and momentum, ended up capturing not just machines, but the infrastructure needed to keep some of those machines running. That is the hidden answer buried inside this story. The one the German officers, who saw their own tanks fighting against them, never fully grasped. It was not that Soviet engineers were secretly better than German ones. It was that the Red Army had built, out of desperate necessity earlier in the war, an entire culture of field improvisation and salvage that most professional Western armies would have considered beneath them. Soviet workshops routinely cannibalized wrecks for parts. Soviet crews were trained, out of necessity, to operate and maintain whatever machine they were handed, because in 1941 and 1942, that machine might be an obsolete T-26 one week and a Lend-Lease Valentine the next. A crew culture built on adaptability, forged by catastrophe, turned out to be exactly the right tool for absorbing enemy technology at scale. By 1943, this had become organized enough that specific units were formed almost entirely around captured armor. Several independent tank companies and at least one full-strength unit fielded exclusively German-built vehicles, Panzer IIIs and IVs primarily, with a scattering of Stu-G assault guns valued for their low profile and reliable gun. These units were not treated as novelties. They were assigned real combat tasks, real sectors of the front, and their tank crews, many of them men who had previously lost their own vehicles and been retrained rather than simply reassigned to infantry, took genuine pride in operating what amounted to captured enemy steel against the army that built it. There was a particular danger baked into all of this, and the Red Army knew it from the start. A German tank silhouette rolling toward a Soviet trench, whatever paint job it wore, triggered instinct before it triggered recognition. Friendly fire against captured vehicles was a real and recurring problem throughout the war, serious enough that specific standing orders were issued requiring oversized identification markings, extra red stars, sometimes painted turret numbers, in Cyrillic large enough to read from 300 meters, and requiring forward units to be briefed whenever a captured vehicle formation was operating nearby. Even with all of that, incidents happened. Soviet anti-tank gunners, trained to fire first at anything resembling a Panzer IV silhouette, because hesitation against the real thing meant death, sometimes did exactly that against their own captured tanks. It was one of the strange cruelties of the program, the very shape that made these machines valuable, the German engineering that made them worth stealing, also made them targets for the men they were fighting alongside. The system behind all this went deeper than paint and orders, though. At Kubinka, outside Moscow, the Soviets operated a proving ground where captured vehicles were not just repaired, but studied with genuine scientific seriousness. Engineers there tore down Panther transmissions to understand German metallurgy. They fired captured 88mm guns against captured German armor plate to build tables of penetration data that fed directly back into the design of new Soviet tanks. This is worth pausing on because it means the 317 captured vehicles were never purely a battlefield curiosity. They were, in a very real sense, intelligence assets, feeding directly into the evolution of Soviet tank design during the very years the T-34-85 and the IS-2 heavy tank were being refined. Some of the sloped armor geometry decisions and gun mounting choices that Soviet designers made in this period were informed, at least in part, by what their engineers learned, tearing apart machines built in Kassel. The single most dramatic collision between belief and reality came in the summer of 1944, during the opening phase of Operation Bagration, when Soviet forces, advancing through Belorussia, encountered a captured Tiger tank, operating with a forward reconnaissance element. The vehicle had been recovered nearly a year earlier, repaired at a rear workshop, and quietly assigned to a mixed unit tasked with probing German defensive lines ahead of the main advance. Its Soviet crew, commanded by a lieutenant whose name survives in unit records only as Volkov, used the Tiger's imposing silhouette and heavy frontal armour exactly the way German doctrine intended it to be used, as a battering ram that German anti-tank guns expecting to see their own side's armour, hesitated to fire on until it was far too close to matter. The confusion this caused among German defenders, some of whom reported the presence of friendly armour in radio traffic minutes before their position was overrun, illustrates precisely how thoroughly a captured weapon can invert the assumptions built around it. The Germans had spent years training soldiers to trust the outline of a tiger. That trust, in this instance, became the mechanism of their own defeat. None of this happened without cost, and it would be dishonest to tell this story as one of clean triumph. Crews who volunteered for captured vehicle service knew they were operating machines with no reliable parts pipeline. Once existing stocks ran dry, no factory-trained repair doctrine, and instrumentation labelled entirely in German, which more than one Soviet mechanic later admitted he learned to read only well enough to keep an engine from seizing. Breakdown rates in these units ran noticeably higher than in standard T-34 formations. When something failed catastrophically, in the transmission, in the tracks, under fire, there was often no factory authorised fix, only field expedients and prayer. Men died in these machines, not just from enemy shells, but from mechanical failures nobody back home fully understood, in vehicles fighting a war their designers never intended them to fight. On the wrong side of the front, they were built to attack. By the final year of the war, the practical value of most captured German armour had begun to decline, not because the machines stopped working, but because Soviet industry itself had caught up and then surpassed the need for them. The T-34-85 and the IS-2 were being produced in numbers the Wehrmacht could no longer match, and a captured Panzer IV, however well maintained, was simply outclassed by the newer Soviet designs rolling off assembly lines in the Urals. Many of the 317 recovered vehicles were gradually withdrawn from frontline combat units over the course of 1944 and into 1945. Reassigned to training roles, used to teach new tank crews how enemy armour behaved, how its optics worked, where its weak points sat on the glacis plate. A number were retained permanently for evaluation and historical purposes at Kubinka, where several still sit today, their turrets marked with the paint schemes and unit numbers assigned to them decades ago by men whose names mostly went unrecorded. A smaller number were simply run into the ground, worked past the point of economical repair, and quietly scrapped for the steel, their service records closing with a single stamped line. Withdrawn from use, condition unserviceable. So what does this really answer, beyond satisfying curiosity about where 317 enemy tanks ended up? It answers something about the difference between designing a war machine and surviving one. German engineering in this period was, by almost any technical measure, extraordinary. The armour, the optics, the gun-to-weight ratios were often genuinely superior to their Soviet equivalents on paper. But a tank does not fight on paper. It fights inside a system of supply, repair, doctrine, and human adaptability. And it was precisely in that system, the unglamorous, improvisational, bureaucratic machinery of trophy recovery and field repair, that the Soviet Union found an advantage nobody in Berlin had planned for. The Wehrmacht built machines meant to be irreplaceable extensions of German industrial superiority. The Red Army, out of years of desperate necessity, had built a culture capable of absorbing almost anything handed to it, including the enemy's own weapons, and turning that absorption into a small but genuine strategic asset. It is worth remembering, before the story closes, that the men inside those captured tanks were rarely thinking about doctrine or industrial philosophy. They were thinking about whether the transmission would hold for one more push, whether the next silhouette on the horizon would recognise the star painted over the cross before it fired, whether the German instruments in front of them, still labelled in a language most of them could not read, would tell them the truth in the last seconds that mattered. Some of them lived because a machine built to kill them instead carried them home. Some of them died inside that same machine, victims of a war that did not particularly care which flag was painted on the hull. 317 tanks is a strange kind of monument, not to victory exactly, but to the sheer improvisational will it took to survive a war of that scale, one seized, repaired, and repurposed vehicle at a time